Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and you can see my bench has a few things arranged out here in preparation for a worm bin feeding. I've got my glove on standby. This is the food that I'm going to be feeding the worms today. It's some chopped up white pumpkin, something I've not yet given my worms before. I got a little bit of lettuce in here too. So the white pumpkin looks kind of like this, white in color versus the typical orange. It was soon after the Halloween season had ended that I saw one of my neighbors had placed a whole bunch of pumpkins out on their front lawn in preparation for the trash man to come get them the next day, and I figured I would save them. So the bins that we're going to be feeding are actually down here. They're red wiggler bins. What you see up here are really just placeholders for other containers that are older than these. Because the oldest stuff is up here, and then you work your way down to the younger and younger and younger, and you work your way off to the right to get to the youngest systems. It's interesting, pumpkin has been kind of a theme down here. This container right here represents my oldest system, currently active system, which is actually a grow bag with worms in it, a grow bag that I bought in from outside. And over there I had placed in a small size pumpkin, kind of similar in size to the one we just looked at over here on the bench. And then that other container off on the right side on the top shelf represents another pumpkin fed to the African night crawlers, a pumpkin this size but an orange one, which we're filming a time lapse with. So let's get those red wiggler bins up on the bench and get them fed. I hope they like this white pumpkin. It's my first time feeding this stuff, so hopefully it goes well. Alright, let's get to work. So now the reason they're getting stuff like pumpkin and lettuce, it's because I want to give them stuff that I know is going to break down pretty quickly, where we're not going to see all kinds of leftovers of the past feedings lingering for a very long time. Because this bin now at 270 days of age and the other bin at 252 days of age, they're getting up there in age, and I'd like to, consider getting them geared up for harvest one of these days and get the worms busy on a nice new batch of stuff to work on. So like even in the last feeding, we didn't give them any fresh bedding. I believe we had maybe taken some old scraps of top covering newspaper, like what these pieces are serving that function of right now, and we might have incorporated those as bedding in the last feeding, but we didn't give them any fresh bedding like from my fresh bedding supply, and I didn't really intend to do that today either. So I just figured we'd continue leaving pieces of paper like these out on the top as top covering, so that if they do have sort of a craving for a more carbon heavy food item, then they could always come up to the surface and nibble on that. I mean, not that they would know to go there for that if it was something that they needed dietarily, if that's a word. But whatever, at least it's there and it's available. And throughout the bin, you're still going to find scraps of little pieces of, bedding that used to be applied in pretty generous amounts here and there. So if they need a more carbon-rich food source, it's in here. But I don't want to add any more. I'd really like to start winding things down here. So I believe pumpkin, lettuce. I've also got some coffee. I've got my worm chow mix here too. Stuff like that I think is food that would go pretty quick. So here too, what they got 10 days ago at their last feeding was pumpkin and coffee. Stuff that we would hope to see break down pretty quickly. We were bumping into leftovers from feedings gone by. So like two feedings ago, I know there was a half of a banana peel thrown in here as food. And I think we ran into leftovers of that. There was asparagus applied as one of the feedings a few weeks back. I'm pretty sure we were bumping into some leftovers of that as well. Whether or not we're going to see leftovers of that stuff still, I don't know. I mean, here for example, the stem of a banana. Not too surprising to find that as leftovers. Another one. The asparagus, though, was starting to show pretty good signs of getting worn down. Here, I'm not sure what this is. It feels to me like a piece of corn cob, which is something you're definitely going to see leftovers of going, weeks and weeks after it was added as a fresh food item. So that's something that I would definitely not be adding as a food item today. Another interesting thing that we kept bumping into here was leftovers from a feeding that probably goes back a good month and a half now, perhaps even longer, was leftovers of tomato. And for the longest time, even I believe at the last check-in, we were seeing skin of tomato, like the outer thin skin, and here we go. That's what I was wondering about. We did bump into a couple of these little tiny cherry tomatoes that were amazingly holding out still, where the skin had not been punctured, so the liquid inside of it is still there. And you see all this fibrous stuff over here? I couldn't tell you for sure what it is, but it's probably some of the asparagus. Because the worms went into each piece of the asparagus and nibbled out all the soft stuff that was in the middle, and they left behind the outer piece of it, which is much more tough and fibrous. But, you know, it's really just a matter of time how long it's going to take for them to break it all down. And I wondered what it would look like in future days, and it's getting there slowly, but still not quite done. Here even we've got some other cherry tomatoes which haven't survived the way that first one we found has, because those have already had their outer skin punctured, and the worms know enough to sneak inside and slurp up the fluid, the juices. So eventually that little cherry tomato we found that's still intact for the most part will get, you know, pierced, and the fluids will become accessible. Here even we got a stem of tomato here that was probably part of the garden tomatoes that I bought in. So yeah, those tomato leftovers are stuff from my garden, believe it or not. Stuff that I bought in as green tomatoes when the first frost was expected. And over time they ripened, we ate some of them, but some of them just never really became palatable for human consumption and just ended up becoming worm food eventually. So yeah, there is a lot of, look at that, just a big mob of worms together. Sometimes I want to pick through the pile thinking that maybe I'll see what it is that's got them all jazzed. What are they so excited about? What are they eating? But I don't see. Whatever it was is for the most part gone, it seems. Here too, a leftover piece of something. I don't know what it is. Alright, you know what? I'm going to leave these worms to sort of wriggle out of view, and then we'll come in here with today's feeding. So let's give them a moment to chill out. Tell you, I'm really curious to see how long that little tomato is going to last. If I'm not mistaken, we had one in the other system too that was still holding out. And I didn't really pay that much attention last time to trying to make sure that I put it back into the system in such a way that it doesn't get damaged or burst. But I guess since it's here and in plain view and reminding me that we could take this as an opportunity to just try to protect it from being broken, we could easily do that right now as we return some of these leftover bits that we found along the way to the feeding area. And they're dwindling. But that one piece of, you know, corn cob bit, I wonder how long that's going to last. I'm tempted sometimes just to break that sort of stuff up a little bit to help it along, but I resist that urge. I just leave it be and let nature take its course in the worm bin and see how long it takes to get broken up. So let's see, here we got some nice lettuce leaves, but we've also got the core stem of the head of lettuce. So that's the sort of thing we can't really divvy up to two separate bins. We're just going to give them the stem, I suppose, and we'll leave the majority of these leaves for the other system. And, well, let's see about giving them an equal share of these pumpkin bits. We'll just spread it out. And you know, I don't think I remember seeing any leftovers of the pumpkin. I mean, sometimes you'll see a little hint of the skin, because the skin is a little bit tougher for the worms to work through. And sometimes you even see a little bit of the orange, you know, leftovers on it. But yeah, here you can see some of this sort of rot that was starting to happen. That was the reason I decided it was time to carve that little white pumpkin up. But since the other one is still holding out, I'm keeping it intact, because I really don't have that much space to store a bunch of frozen pumpkin. Even by cutting up that little pumpkin, I pretty much utilized all the space that I had. And here too, you know, some of these really rotted chunks. I took the most rotted chunks and I just threw them in my outdoor compost barrel. But then the stuff that looked a little bit nicer, I kept it here. So let's give these little guys about half of the coffee that I came down here with. I got a little bit more we can give to them, and then we're going to try to increase the appeal of this somewhat boring coffee by sprinkling a little bit of worm chow too. Although I guess with that coffee resting right on top of those delicious pumpkin bits, I assume that they're delicious. I would guess that all that stuff's probably going to get eaten pretty quickly. And then, you know, gradually the leftovers of the asparagus, the leftovers of the corn cob, everything will go in time at its own unique pace. And at some point soon we'll get to the point where we'll be down to only castings in here. There's also going to be some time needed for all that little residual bedding material that is floating around throughout the system to also get broken down. So yeah, I mean, you know, 270 days of age, it's getting up there. So at some point we'll have to start thinking about getting these worms relocated into a nice new place. See here, you can even see some of the outer tougher skin of this piece of asparagus, and as it all gets broken down, it turns into this real stringy, fibrous stuff. And until it breaks down to that point, the worms can't do a whole lot with it. They'll always nibble away what they can, and then they'll come back for the rest once that's been broken down to the point where they can nibble on it. So let's put these little guys back up on the shelf, because it's on to bin number 2 to get the other one fed as well. So that other bin actually has what I refer to as my original red wigglers in it. And I think we've got everybody off my glove. We'll come back in with this feeding zone indicator, coffee filter just showing us where we last fed. And you know, since that piece of plastic rests out on the top surface, I believe that all these top covering sheets of paper serve as a pretty good little landing pad for all the moisture that would otherwise escape from the system and condenses on that plastic. They just sort of drip down onto these top coverings, and then the worms really seem to enjoy hanging out on this stuff. All these castings that you see resting on top of this paper, it's all evidence of worm traffic, as is the presence of worms in between the bubbles of the bubble wrap. And then at the very end, I'll just put on something to provide them with a little bit of shade. Previously, I was using a piece of cardboard to provide shade, but I needed that piece of cardboard for something else. That's why we got this here, a replacement shade cover. So let's get these guys back up on the shelf and get the other system fed. Here we go. Right there on the label. Original worms. So yeah, I had a little trouble with my my poor original worm population. I mean, I had a hard time finding even a few survivors when I had this wicked die-off of all my red wiggler bins, almost down to the point where I thought I had lost all traces of the original population of worms with which I had started my worm farming hobby, if you want to call it that. But we were able to scrape up a few. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a very small number, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 or 30 worms, because we did actually count them and we placed them into a little safe space so that they can hopefully get back on their feet. And then as their population grew and grew, we kept working them up into larger and larger habitats. And it is really nice to see how well they've done. And for whatever reason, I've just been kind of operating on this feeling like I'd like to just keep these separate, you know, because they are almost, I don't know, it's hard to say, you know. A lot of my other systems are populated with worms that I recruited from my compost barrel outside, but in a way I almost feel like my compost barrel outside probably is, to a certain degree, populated by worms that originated from my original batch somehow. But I guess there's a certain amount of novelty, and I guess, I don't know. Is the word novelty? I know there's a specific word for that, right? A certain amount of sentimentality. This looks to me like a piece of... This is actually the material that I believe a couple of my homemade worm bags are made out of, but it's stuff that's not going to break down. So whenever I bump into stuff that looks like it's not going to break down, I try to fish it out. So these bins have been managed as buddy bins for quite some time, so we're going to see commonalities between these two. I mean, you saw right from the beginning, you know, covering with bubble wrap with a shade on top, and even the top coverings of a feeding zone indicator and a couple fragments of newspaper on either side of it. I mean, you know, we don't go crazy trying to maintain consistency between the bins, but as long as they're being managed concurrently, they're getting the same food, they're being, you know, handled in much the same ways, and they've got the same history, obviously, at least going back to the point where they got buddied up as buddy bins. So here too, we're going to see leftovers of stringy stuff like this, which is probably asparagus. Maybe we'll see a few banana stems. And I guess there might even be an unpunctured cherry tomato floating around in here somewhere too. And I don't really want to go out of my way terribly to try to zero in on where it's at. I'm just kind of operating on the assumption that there might be one in here too, because I remember for a while we had actually found intact cherry tomatoes in both systems, and we were kind of in awe of the fact that they were still intact. And this looks like pumpkin, believe it or not, a little piece of leftover pumpkin from the last feeding. And I guess that, you know, has the possibility of happening if it just happens to be, here's a banana stem, if it just happens to be resting up against something and access to it by the worms is obstructed. So I'm not that surprised, but it is a little surprising sometimes when you bump into a leftover of something that you really didn't expect to find. So I'm just kind of doing a quick glance through the material to see if we bump into an intact cherry tomato by chance. Not holding my breath. My real purpose for doing this is to open up enough space for us to drop in today's feeding. And, you know, let's do what we did before. Let's give these worms a chance to retreat down into the material, and then we can place in all this frozen food with a clear conscience, knowing that we're not freezing out any poor worms by putting the food right on top of them. So let's give them a minute. I'll tell you, it's remarkable how quickly these worms vanish out of view sometimes. So let's just drop in what remains of the food portion that they're getting today. A pretty good sized chunk of lettuce, a few pieces of white pumpkin, and, you know, 10 days interval between feedings. Seems to be about right. It was 10 days interval between the last feeding and the prior feeding, which was very similar to this feeding with the pumpkin and with the coffee. So that would tell me that if we were to return to this system in another 10 or so days, we'll probably find a similar result, assuming that they're going to like the white pumpkin as much as they liked the the orange pumpkin, but I have no reason to believe that there's that big of a difference. I really don't know though, so like I said, this is the first time I've ever fed the white pumpkin. Hopefully it just doesn't end up sitting in here for months and months without them wanting to touch it. I suppose we'll see. I'm sure a lot of viewers have probably already fed this stuff to their worm bins and have some experience with it, so I'd be curious to see or hear in the comments if anyone can tell me in advance what to expect. So I think we're pretty much done here. Let's start backfilling this feeding area. Perhaps here and there we'll bump into a chunk of leftover material that we can try to submerge down into the feeding area. Here and there I bump into some stuff that looks like leftovers. Over here, I think this might have been where we excavated all the wormies too. That's why we're seeing so many of them over here. So we're going to try to get all that stuff back down into the feeding area where all the action's going to be, so it has a better chance of being consumed by the worms. Here and there a pumpkin seed, which seems like one of those things that's going to take forever. Alright, let's bring in a little bit of material from this side too. And I think over here we had gathered up some of the dry top surface materials. We can get that down near the feeding area as well. And here's a whole bunch more worms. Very nice, busy bin. And so many puny worms, you know? I wonder if that could be partially due to the fact that this seems to be a pretty heavily populated bin. I always kind of got the impression that you're not going to get big monster-sized worms when you have a large population. They seem to limit their growth in size individually for whatever reason, or at least that's what I found with my African night crawlers. I see other people growing them in smaller quantities in very large systems, and they get these big monster African night crawlers, and every time I run African night crawlers, they seem to remain pretty small. These are, you know, red wigglers, a smaller breed of worm than African night crawlers. So you don't really expect them to become too huge. But I have seen examples of them growing quite large. And in the right conditions, the right type of feeding, they'll grow that way. But when they're crowded like this, I believe one of the side effects is a somewhat smaller sized worm in general. I guess leaving room for more of them to crowd into that small space. Alright, well that was a pretty fun check-in with our, I guess, not oldest systems, but they're getting up there. Another month from now, we're going to have the older system, already reaching 300 days of age. And even here, as we were sort of excavating, I really felt like I was getting very close to the upper rim of the container, almost feeling like I was out of space. And a lot of times that is my trigger point, you know, that says no more room. Let's start gearing towards, you know, harvest of the castings and relocation of the worms based on the fact that we're probably at or close to the limit of the container. So that's it for today. I got a few things I'll take care of getting cleaned up and put away after the camera stops rolling. But before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.